This is the Forbes Books Podcast, conversations with remarkable folks who are impacting the world of business and beyond. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and on paper, my guest this week looks more like a character out of a Tom Clancy novel. Infantry officer, neurosurgeon, military commander. But I promise, he is 100% real. Dr. Leon Morris has dedicated his life to compassionate patient care and inspirational leadership, both in the battlefield and in the hospital. He's the author of the new book, All Physicians Lead, which is a guide for doctors who want to improve their leadership skills and impact the healthcare system. Drawing from his extensive experience as a neurosurgeon and healthcare leader in the U.S. Army, Dr. Morris shares the principles and practices that have helped him and his colleagues achieve excellence in medicine and leadership. Guided by an ethos of service, honor, and healing, Leon's career has been one of duty, sacrifice, and caring, and I can't wait for you to hear his story. Dr. Leon Morris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here. Appreciate everything that's going on. The world is a good place.
It is a good place. I like to say that too. I like that attitude, Doc. And so I want to start by talking to you about my first experience with a doctor. So when I was a little kid, I'm a Gen Xer. And when I was a little kid, whenever I was sick, whether it was a cold, runny nose, fever, flu, stub my toe, my mom takes me to this doctor, Dr. Gomez in Bayonne, New Jersey. Still remember the guy's name. He would give me a shot of penicillin, no matter what. Like he would literally say, take your pants down. I'm going to shoot him in the ass with this needle, with this penicillin. And for whatever reason, it scarred me because like I hated going to the doctor. So like I was just, like, as I grew up, I went to my mom, like, Mom, is that weird that every time we went to the doctor, he always wanted to give us penicillin? And I don't know if that was a thing in the 80s, and then we've kind of got away from it a little bit. But talk to me about how doctors have evolved from that sort of default setting. Because I feel like doctors have evolved just like everybody else, where it's like, hey, we treat everything the same way. Let's just do it. How has medicine evolved since, you started practicing and since I've been alive? Like, talk to me about some of that evolution.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Back in that day, there wasn't nearly the emphasis on overprescribing opioids, overprescribing antibiotics. We didn't really have the long-term data that said when we give everybody antibiotics, we create these horribly resistant strains of bacteria that then are much, much harder to treat when you have a serious infection. So I think the emphasis on that has driven both of those down. If anything, though, the consumer input demand, if you will, has skyrocketed. The evolution of the internet, folks are much more attuned to their health and health needs, means that they're coming into doctors' offices with their own idea of how they should be treated, much more frequently than I saw 30 years ago when I started this.
And I think I noticed this, and agree or disagree with me if you like, sir, but I noticed this when the TV commercial said, ask your doctor about Ozempic. And then, so we don't want to get into whole down rabbit hole about the pharmaceutical industry and all, but to me, that's when I noticed where the power of the patient started to step up, where literally big pharma is telling people, yeah, go ahead and tell your doctor to give you this thing that we're trying to sell you in between plays of a football game.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's interesting, too, that what you see is ask your doctor about Ozempic, which may be $15,000 a year. They don't say, ask your doctor about healthy eating habits, which is free.
Yeah.
So capitalism is great in many ways. In some ways, there are perverse incentives to do just this, and you don't have any personal responsibility for it. You get this shot, you'll lose weight, and you can still continue to eat pizza at the Super Bowl.
It's so funny you bring this up.
Not to say anything wrong with eating pizza at the Super Bowl, but every day is a little excessive.
It does. Yeah, it goes a little overboard. And it's funny that you bring this up because Bill Maher has been on this soapbox for about 3 years now, how that during the pandemic, doctors and the government, when people were told to stay home, they didn't say, hey, maybe start exercising, maybe try a healthy routine. And the argument is that the healthcare industry isn't really here to make people healthy. It's to keep them alive, and to keep them alive is to make money by selling pharmaceuticals. So how do you fall on this in the way that, not about again, don't want to fall in a rabbit hole about vaccines or anything like that, but the fact that no major doctor, the faces of the pandemic that we used to see on our screens every day, instead of talking about X, Y, and Z, they just avoided talking about, hey, maybe adapt a healthier lifestyle. Is that, again, going back to the big old nasty big pharma again?
Yeah, that's a very, very broad question. I think if you take anybody who's applying to medical school, starting medical school, going into a residency, 99.8% of those folks go in because they want to take care of patients. They want to improve lives, save lives, extend lives. It's way too much work and way too much debt and way too much delayed gratification to not have some really core desire to help others. The question that you talked about is more the, down the road, politically engaged, economically engaged, if you talk about physicians that are going into the pharmaceutical agencies. That's still there, but there are then other factors that come into play in the decision-making and the recommendations that are made, and particularly recommendations that are broad-based, these epidemiological discussions about what's best for the patient. I think during the pandemic, we focused solely on this one thing, trying to prevent as many people from getting COVID or from experiencing really bad outcomes from COVID. At the national level, at the regional and state levels, often didn't explore the second and third order effects of many of the things that we were telling people to do. And I say telling, not recommending, right? Telling people to do under penalty of law in many cases. The long-term economic effects, the effects on kids in school and learning degradation, the effects of behavioral health challenges, delayed diagnoses because people weren't seeing their primary care docs and getting cancer screenings, things like that. So if you don't look at the entire system and really focus on that one thing, you're ignoring a lot of the side effects. And that would be, like me recommending brain surgery and ignoring the fact that it might cause a hemorrhage or a stroke or an infection and not taking that into account in the decision-making. The final decision might be the same, but at least you've accounted for the known knowns that can go badly. I certainly, looking back, living through it like we all did, can sympathize with, not just empathize with, many of the decision makers in that initially, for the first 6, 8, 10 months, we really had no idea how scary this was going to be. It turned out to cause millions of deaths, which is horrible, but we didn't know that it might not cause hundreds of millions of deaths. So when you're doing that calculus saying we might be able to prevent a third of the planet from dying, we don't know that won't happen unless we are very, very, very stringent with our requirements. Again, not recommendations, but requirements. At some point, beyond that first 6, 8, 9 months of evaluation and where it's truly going and how truly bad it is and which patients it's really hurting badly, we had opportunities to reassess and say, okay, maybe it's time to dial it back. And some communities did, some countries did successfully, but it became such a politically charged issue that it was very, very difficult to dial back. And I think this is one of the faults of the scientists, and in reality have exacerbated some of the I don't trust the science. Because rather than saying, hey, we're scientists, this is the best we know right now, this could change though as we get more data, and as we received more data, actually make changes. The trust the science became don't question, right, in many instances. And the big challenge that we're going to have to come back from in the scientific and medical community is the loss of trust that engendered. And I think that's going to take years, maybe decades for some people.
Wow. And it's funny because for 100 years of modern medicine, doctors have been accused of having a bit of a God complex. And that was because they sort of had the final answer. They're the ones who went to medical school. They read all the books. And now when we talk about all this information that's at hand, that we can all see all the same information that doctors are reading and have access to, it does bring this sort of like paradigm shift of the God complex of the doctor. Like, hey, just because you went to medical school, you can't tell me what you did to my body. It's weird for me as a Gen Xer to grow up into like, hey, well, the doctor says do this. Okay, I'm going to do this, or I won't do that. But I'm not going to say, hey, doctor, you're full of it. And I'm sure for you, that's kind of weird to see that change over the course of your career.
It is. It's been a gradual enough transition. I mean, initially when people could access the internet, I don't know what, I can't do the math on that, 20
2000
years ago.
So 20 years ago. Yeah.
And they'd come in with 50-page printer stack saying, oh, I read all this stuff, totally non-curated, totally random, most of it completely irrelevant to the question at hand. That was a bit terrifying. First of all, I was much younger then, so the gray hairs and the experience help, and saying, okay, I'll listen to everything you say, and in the end, we're going to come to a nice place together, rather than, oh no, I'm being questioned and I don't even know who's questioning me. The stack of paper is questioning me. So to some degree, the longitudinal change as you're in it and living through it hasn't been as abrupt as is perceived by folks who aren't practicing medicine, for instance, who saw the pandemic, who maybe before the pandemic said, okay, yeah, I trust my doctor, I trust the healthcare systems, I trust the FDA and the NIH, and then boom, flip a switch. I'm going to question a lot because I just feel differently now.
Well, thank you for indulging me on this, Dr. Leon. And it's funny, too, because you and I have spoken in the past, and we joked how I said that I used to know Dr. Oz years ago, and when Dr. Oz went out in public, no matter the situation, whether it was a 5-star restaurant or he was in a bathroom, people would approach him and ask for medical advice. So is that something that you go through? Like if someone finds out you're a doctor, it's like, oh boy, the rest of my night's done. I'm going to be diagnosing this individual I just met 30 seconds ago while drinking a glass of wine.
Oh yeah, all the time. And the second most common reason that people go see doctors is back pain, and that's in the realm of neurosurgical practice. So I can't even say, that's really not what I do. So fortunately, as I've migrated almost 100% of my practice into pediatrics, I said, are you over 18? Because if you are,
I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
Beg off that way. But maybe my best response to that is one of the nurses in our practice right now has a little block on her desk that says, yes, I'm a nurse. No, I don't want to look at it. So I make it a button that says that.
What is the oddest interaction you've ever had? Is there one that stands out, or are they just kind of all weird when people randomly ask you for advice?
Funny that you should ask that. I think the oddest interaction I've had was at a national meeting just week before last. In all my medical career, the most unusual interaction, I was sitting between sessions at a table in this big open area. And there weren't a lot of people here. It might have been lunchtime and most people were out. There were a few people scattered at tables around. There was a woman sort of way across this big open foyer charging her cell phone. And at some point she picks up and walks over and says, can I sit here? There's 2-person tables. Yes, ma'am. Sure. No worries. She said, I want to plug in my phone. That one's not working. Okay. That happens, right? So a few minutes later, I get up and I'm starting to head out. She goes, are you a doctor? We're at a neurosurgical convention. What are the odds that the old white guy happens to be a doctor? Yes. Oh, yeah. Are you a neurosurgeon? Yes. Well, I need some help. Doctors implanted a wire into my brain and they're monitoring me. I said, oh, that's interesting. We do implant wires into people's brains. It was supposed to help with seizures. And now I know that the NSA and the government and big pharma are monitoring me constantly and I need to get this out. I said, well, you should go back to your doctor and have it taken out. Well, I can't because they're in on it.
Oh, no.
Well, where do you live? And I forget where she said, but she traveled many states to come to this neurosurgery convention in DC. And I'm trying to back up slowly,
Out.
politely. I do pediatric cases. I don't really know anything about this technology. Well, you should. She starts pulling out like some paperwork and folders that describe how these devices are working into people's brains and actually driving it. And she's just going on.
Oh, boy. And this poor soul traveled because she knew that this was going to be a convention, and
I can only assume that she's going to accost a number of neurosurgeons to see if someone will intervene on her behalf. Right there, strangest, random. It wasn't even a guest at a party that we were
that you have to humor or something like that.
You know,
yeah.
This was like,
wow, that's a great story. And and speaking of stories, your life is a great story. I mean, if there's not a movie about you one day, I don't know. I don't know how that's even possible, because the fact that you're an army doctor and saving people's skulls on the front lines of battle, it's such a crazy thing, and it's a situation where you probably never thought it would ever happen, because I know you wanted to be a doctor from a very early age, but the track that you took to become a doctor really veered off course there for a majority of your life. So talk to me about your passion for medicine, but then the intersection of the military. How did that all come about?
Well, when I look back, it's a series of random events that shaped this career life that turned out wonderfully, but was completely unpredictable. And in 5th grade, we went on a library field trip. And even in 5th grade, I was a bit competitive, and we were told to sign out a book, and we were to read it, and then we were going to give a report to the class, an oral report about the book. So people were pulling magazines and comic books, and 5th grade, I just looked on the shelf and just grabbed the biggest, thickest hardcover book. I said, I'm going to win this. I'm going to win. I don't even know what I'm going to win, but whatever it is, I'm going to win it. I pulled this book off the shelf, and it was The Making of a Surgeon by William Nolan, about his residency in Bellevue, New York in the, probably 50s and 60s. And I read it and said, that's it. That's what I want to do. And really didn't veer much from that. Took a few detours. The first being in high school, when I had all the applications growing up in Connecticut. So the applications into all the usual players for pre-med, Wesleyan, Yale, Harvard, Hopkins. And a guidance counselor, Bob Gilligan, never forget, Mr. Gilligan came up to me one day and said, you're captain of the track team, captain of the hockey team, president of this. You should think about going to West Point. And here I was growing up 2 hours away from the military academy at West Point and had no idea that it existed, let alone was a premier undergraduate institution. And I looked at him and I remember this quote like it was yesterday. He said, I want to go to college. I don't want to join the Army. And he said, no, West Point is a college. And I think you can go to medical school out of West Point. So I said, all right, fine, I'll look. As I looked through the catalog, it appeared to me that this was a very team-oriented institution. And that was how I grew up, how I perceived myself, as others before self and, team first. When I interviewed at a lot of the other pre-med programs, it was very individualistic, very cutthroat. So my first visit to West Point sold me. And I said, this is the environment that I want to be in. Up to 2% of each graduating class can go straight to medical school. I was fortunate to be in that range when I graduated, was accepted into my first choice in medical school, which was the Uniformed Services University here in Bethesda, Maryland. And another random diversion, I joke that going to West Point is like joining a cult. They shave your head and you run up and down the street singing, I want to be an airborne ranger. And pretty soon you start thinking you actually do want to be an airborne ranger. So I took my acceptance in hand, went to the medical school in Bethesda and said, I want a deferment. I want to go out and do a tour as a line infantry commander. and then come back to medical school. And they said, well, we really don't do that. But the individual in the admissions office that I talked to walked me right to the senior director of the admissions office, who walked me to the director of the admissions office, who walked me right over to the dean's office. Little did I know, the dean of the medical school at the time, Jay Sanford, went to airborne school when he was 50. He was an infectious disease doctor in Vietnam and really thought it would be beneficial for future military doctors to do some time as line officers, but he couldn't get up in front of a group of applicants and ask for a volunteer because that could potentially be coercion. So they were waiting for someone to walk in and say, hey, I want to do this, in order to beta test this program. So I did that. They approved it. They said, well, we don't have an official program, so you're still going to have to reapply. You won't have to retake the medical admission test. You probably won't have to interview. Your scores are great, but you still need to be medically fit. If you break your leg and you can't be an Army officer anymore, then sorry, go to Yale.
Wow. And so let me jump in here, because so you apply for that deferment, but traditionally the track would be go to West Point, go to medical school, then you serve. Is
that's
that
right?
That's a normal
as
track.
A doctor
which is
different
military
than serving as an infantry commander or a fighter pilot or a ship driver.
And why was that so important to you to do it that way?
Couple of reasons. One was just the indentured servitude associated with going straight in. Your military obligation from West Point is 5 years. That's added to the military obligation from medical school of 7 years, and you don't start paying any of that back until you finish your residency and fellowship, which for me was 10 years.
Wow. So you're 10 years in and then owe the government 12
more.
Woo!
Yeah. And you've been in uniform for 4 years at West Point and 4 years of medical school. Do the math, 30 years is
There's
like
probably
that.
easier ways to be doctors, right, Leon?
So I thought, okay, well, if I don't like the Army, I mean, I know what West Point's like, but I don't know what the Army's like. So let me go out and do some time, see if I really like it before I make that commitment. The other thing is, if I was going to be taking care of soldiers for my career, I wanted to see what they were doing for a living. And as a doctor, having that experience turned out to be very valuable. When I was talking to infantry commanders and saying, hey, this soldier can't go back to duty, and they're like, hey, doc, tell me why not. But I had master parachutist wings and a ranger tab and an infantry rifle on my uniform. They're like, oh, okay, this doc has been there and done that. And so it gives you a level of credibility with your patients and their teams that I found very helpful throughout my career. But the other one really was, this was my gap years, right? Everybody wants to take a gap year nowadays. So my government-sponsored Outward Bound program was to, do a tour with the 82nd Airborne Division, jump out of airplanes and shoot things and blow things up.
But you couldn't have known that as a kid, right? That doing this deferment would help you down the line because, oh, okay, now when I become a doctor and I've served on the front lines, I'll know what it's like to treat a certain injury or something like that. Or was it just luck? I mean, because to me, it sounds like since you're already doing something that's against the grain with the military, and from my understanding from watching, A Few Good Men and other military movies, you're not supposed to go against the grain. So why did you think going against the grain would serve you, but also serve the country as well?
Great question. Going against the grain coming out of West Point is going to medical school. Going with the grain is being an infantry officer, because it's a combat arms school. You're there to fight the land battle and win. And so to some degree, maybe it was that. My classmates were going into the infantry, going to ranger school, and I said, all right, I'm going to stick with this crew. The fact that most doctors don't do that is because the training is so long. You're going to take 2 or 3 years and do some diversion. You're going to be 50 before you finish this. So there's a disadvantage there. The model that I saw was based on folks who had spent prior time in the enlisted ranks as privates and sergeants and then became officers. At West Point during those 4 years, you could see that the enlisted soldiers saw those officers a little differently because they had been there and done that. So I thought, well, maybe infantry commanders, artillery commanders will see a doctor who's walked in their shoes a little differently, maybe a little bit more credibility. It wasn't a prime driver, and it became much more clear as I experienced it, as you suggested.
Wow.
But it was there in the background.
And to fast forward through the illustrious career that you had, you end up becoming a doctor where you're treating patients literally on the front lines who've had all sorts of catastrophic injuries. Explain what it's like to be a doctor in that setting. Because, again, from what I understand from the movies, Leon, this is how I get all my business. Being a doctor's hard. Being a doctor in a war zone seems a lot harder. Can you give us any, I don't know if you can even put it into words, like describe the scene. How does that even work?
Well, there are certainly some things that are more difficult. You can't just call up the equipment rep like we can here in DC and say, hey, we're doing a case this afternoon and I need this piece of equipment. What you have is what you get when a casualty comes in. And there were numerous cases where we had to figure it out because we didn't have all the bells and whistles that we would have in a major medical center to take care of some very, very severely injured folks. The rewarding part, the big advantage, is that it's pure medicine, pure surgery. You're away from the publisher parish, you're away from the accrediting commissions, you're away from the financial constraints. And if you're not in the operating room, in the ICU, taking care of a patient, you're working out, catching up on your reading, eating ice cream, sleeping. So lather, rinse, repeat, Groundhog Day, every day is something coming in, is something not. The other thing is the bonds that this type of environment builds. When we were deployed right before Operation Iraqi Freedom kicked off, when U.S. soldiers, Marines crossed the border into Iraq, Saddam Hussein started launching Scud missiles. And when a Scud missile launches, it starts to go straight up. We catch it on satellite, and every U.S. unit, because you don't know where this thing is going to land yet, it hasn't started its arc, goes on alert. Alarms sound, everybody dives into bunkers. You're sitting there, full chemical gear, put that on. You're sitting in that bunker until they say, okay, you're clear. So as the missile starts to arc, they know, okay, it's not going to go this way and it's not going to go this way. So we clear those. The further it goes downrange, the more places get sequentially cleared, but everybody lights up and dives into a bunker. Well, they became very aware that there were just the right times to launch those missiles. Right at lunchtime, right at dinner time, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, to be maximally disruptive, because they saw that everybody was disrupted every time a heat bloom was launched. So you're going through that with these. I was, I don't know, late 30s, early 40s at the time, with a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who are heroic and terrified at the same time. And you get to know folks pretty well in that environment. We were thinking we're in a hospital, but we're actually in a war zone as well. And be able to be a mentor and a source of some strength, some comfort, maybe. And if you say, oh, don't worry, it's not going to hit us, they're like, BS, sir, what do you mean it's not going to hit us? How do you know it's not going to hit us? It could very well hit us. And we did have some that landed pretty close to our hospital. But that is just an amazing experience. We talk about folks and we need to help them, and we need to do everything we can to help with mental health crises that folks who've been through things like that and worse go through. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of folks who trained for this, and you can only train so much, there's no way you can replicate that type of experience, come back stronger for it. And that's been shown over and over again throughout many, many conflicts. There's a lot of emphasis and care and compassion, and we appreciate that. for the folks that didn't grow and prosper from it, but the majority of folks do. The second thing that's incredible, not just that bonding, is the level of severity of the injury that we were able to successfully treat and bring people back to life, continue their lives. Throughout history, the survival rate from battle injuries has been 70%, 80%, close to 90%. But in OEF, OIF, if you got to the first physician with a pulse, your survival rate was 98%, which is insane. It's unprecedented in the history of warfare. A lot of that's due to the fact that we were able to provide care very quickly. Every soldier, Marine carried a couple of tourniquets. The medics carried several, and you could stop the bleeding from an amputation on the limb and get them to a surgical facility in a tent, usually, and fix them. One of the models that we use is to put this in perspective for folks who haven't seen it in action. If you're driving around your city and your vehicle gets sideswiped by an 18-wheeler and it pinwheels through the air, flips, you get ejected. As you get ejected, a telephone pole takes off an arm. You have an open book pelvic fracture. You have a big hemothorax that's collapsing in, your heart and lungs. And right before you die, a genie comes up and says he can instantly transport you to any trauma center on the planet. And there are some great ones. There are many, many great ones. Do you go to Ben Taub? Do you go to Harborview? Do you go to UCLA? And the answer is the only place on the planet that has the capability to save you, to put hundreds of units of blood products into you, to be able to manage your physiology in an event like that, is a tent in Afghanistan or Iraq.
Wow.
And the folks that we've saved could never be saved on the Baltimore Beltway or in New York State, because that capability, that experience just doesn't exist anywhere else.
This ties in beautifully to the beginning of the conversation, because you talk about this is the purest form of medicine that you practice. And then we started by talking about the politics of medicine. And it just goes to show the wonders of what doctors can do when all the other bullshit's out of the way. Like just doctor the shit out of it, and you can perform, quote unquote miracles. Is that a model for the next generation of doctors of like, leave all that stuff out of the room, just be a doctor? And I know this is sort of what you're doing with their book and podcast, All Physicians Lead, about just these doctors just being more doctory than worrying about all the other crap that goes to being a doctor in 2023.
Great question. I don't see any way we're going to significantly dial back regulation, oversight, documentation requirements. That's a huge culture change. And anytime at the national level, at the regional level, somebody says, okay, for every regulation we put into place, we have to take away 2. That's just not the way organizations who have oversight think. The model is more regulations we promulgate, the more oversight requirements we can place on, I don't care what it is, the military, hospitals, doctors, the more people we need to oversee those and to administer those, which means we get a bigger budget, which means we have more power and authority. And that's a self-licking ice cream cone. So to dial that back requires just a major cultural, political shift that I don't foresee happening. So what do you do then at the doctor level? You're taking care of patients. Initially, when we started doing electronic medical records and electronic prescribing, what we basically did was we took a lot of administrative tasks and gave them directly to the doctor. So instead of me doing a quick note and then some administrative folks being able to move that forward, I have to fat finger on a keyboard every bit of the prescription and what pharmacy it goes to, and are there any interactions. And so, not playing a prima donna, I can do those things, but from an economic and an efficiency standpoint, you've taken the highest paid person in your organization and given them all of these extra administrative tasks that used to be done by somebody else, but now are embedded in the electronic medical record, billing, coding. We're getting to a point now where with voice dictation and potentially some AI solutions that are coming on board that can just listen to the interaction between the doctor and the patient and then create the note and code it and bill it properly and write the prescription for you, and you just need to check it and sign off on it. That could really get the situation, seeing a patient in clinic, back to where it was 40 years ago, where you'd have a little notepad and you'd scribble a couple of notes while you're looking at the patient, while you're practicing empathy and good listening skills that we're supposed to do to create those trusting relationships, as opposed to feeling pressured with 15 and 20-minute appointments and it takes you 20 minutes to do the note that you're typing while the patient's back here over your shoulder. Not very empathetic. So we may be getting to a cusp where at least the day-to-day interactions, while the regulatory oversight and all of the administrative requirements don't go away or potentially even decrease, there may be tools and techniques, and some of them are eking on board already, that may make us more efficient in dealing with those. But my wish would be, let's look at the last 30 years of all of these administrative and regulatory requirements and think about how many of them we can do away with.
You know, it's funny because, you know, when you were describing the scene of you saving people in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I wonder, like, can you imagine you trying to do that, save someone who just maybe had a limb blown off, but then having to worry about like HMO, insurance, and regulations, and like you couldn't do that, right? It just doesn't work in that world. So I wonder, like, and like you said, the bureaucracy of it will not change, but it's so amazing, like what you're able to accomplish when you don't have all this other crap you have to deal with, like filling in documents and typing up notes. My Lord, man, what an easier world it would be for doctors, right?
It really would. One of the phrases that we use quite frequently is restoring your joy in medicine. And many physicians, if not almost all, feel that weight of all of those requirements, and it detracts from your net experience. Minimizing those, even 5 or 10% can make a big difference. And if anything, as a leader of physicians, if you just show that you're trying to do that, to make them a little bit more efficient so that they can focus on taking care of patients, that's a big boost.
All right, a couple things on a lighter note. Let me ask you the $1 million, or I should say multi-million-dollar question. If you didn't serve in the military and many, many years of you working for this country, saving lives, to how much money you would have made if you become a neurosurgeon right out of medical school? Have you ever crunched the numbers and be like, this house would be just a little bit bigger than the one I'm living in now? Is that something you ever think about, or is it already gone to? Is it like, I like to say, when you're a goalie, puck's in the net, you can't do anything about it. But do you ever be like, man, I'd be driving a nicer car than this? Not that you're doing, but not that you're struggling. I always say this all in jest, but like, do you ever think about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I have a tendency not to look backwards. Boy, what would my life have been like if I'd gone to Yale instead of West Point is not something I do routinely. And one of the things that I was fortunate to get some advice early on that said, look, you're not going to have any student debt if you go this pathway, and you're actually getting a small salary. So start investing that. And the time value of money, starting investments in college, has made up some of that. And so that's advice I give to young folks who are looking at a career similar to my pathway, and take advantage of that, because you're not going to miss that extra 6-pack of beer a week. And if you're putting that into investments, you'll appreciate it when you have kids and grandkids and you're paying mortgages. So.
And lastly, I know you don't like to look back, but every once in a while I bring up the sliding doors question, inspired by the Gwyneth Paltrow movie where she misses the train, her life diverts into one way, and if she gets on the train, it goes another way. what if you didn't pick up that big old giant surgeon book? What if you picked up a book about great architecture by Frank Lloyd Wright? Do you think your life would be any different, or do you think you would have always found yourself working in medicine?
I'm not sure about medicine, but I do think, having also been an amateur psychiatrist throughout my life, looking at other folks and their pathways, one of the things that I've often said is that if I knew what I know now about medical specialties, by the end of my second year of medical school, I could have gone down almost my entire class and said, you're going to be a dermatologist, you're going to be a radiologist, you're going to be an anesthesiologist, because we gravitate toward work and people and groups that we feel comfortable with. So there's probably some architectural school and school of thought and corporation that would have been a great fit for how I think and how I work, and hopefully would have been fortunate to gravitate toward that, or driving race cars, or who knows, all those fantasies.
The normal jump from a doctor to race car driver, it's a very easy jump there.
Buckaroo Banzai, traveler through the eighth dimension, and
no one knows who that movie is, Leon. No one knows. Even if they're over 40, don't know that movie. That movie was a huge bomb. But thank you for trying that. His name is Dr. Leon Morse. The name of the book is All Physicians Lead. Look out for his podcast and book. Leon, it's been a great chat always. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a great day, and you have a good rest of your day.
You as well. And that'll do it for another episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe. That way you'll get new episodes as soon as they're available. And if you have a spare moment, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review, which would help other exceptional entrepreneurs like you discover the show. You can always connect with me on X, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Joe Pardavila, or on TikTok at J Pardavila. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.